The concrete dust hadn't even settled when Preston Cole, I, snatched the yellow legal pad out of Marcus Webb's hands and held it up to the cameras like a mugshot. "This man," Preston said, loud enough for the boom mic to catch every syllable, "has been holding up a $40 million tower because he doesn't like the smell of the rebar." He laughed, and the reporter from the local morning show laughed with him, because that's what you do when your boss laughs. "Sir, I don't pay for feelings. I pay for concrete and steel. If you can't tell the difference, maybe you should go back to pushing a broom." Marcus said nothing. He stood in his reflective vest with the same stillness he'd worn since 6 that morning, gray stubble, frosted with concrete dust, hands cracked and calloused. Eyes fixed not on Preston but on the beam behind him, the one poured 11 days ago with a mix that didn't match the ticket. He didn't reach for the legal pad. He let it fall to the plywood decking, face up, 11 days of careful handwriting scattering in the wind off the river. Somewhere behind the cameras, a woman in a hard hat too big for her frame, the county inspector, Ruth Alvarez, watched the exchange and quietly stepped back out of frame, phone already in hand, already dialing a number she'd been told never to use unless it was serious. It was serious. Marcus had known it for 11 days. Have you ever watched a good man swallow his dignity in silence because he knew something the whole room didn't? In the next few minutes, you're going to watch that same silence bring an entire tower to a stop and reveal exactly whose name was on the blueprints all along. Comment where you're watching from, drop a like, and let's rewind to where it started. 26 years before that legal pad hit the plywood, Marcus Webb was 11 years old, standing on a scaffold his father had built by hand in the backyard on Joy Road, watching Ellis Webb run a torpedo level across a beam with the seriousness of a surgeon checking a pulse. "Steel doesn't lie, Marcus," his father used to say, tapping the level until the bubble sat dead center between the lines. "It doesn't care if you're tired, if you're proud, if you're in a hurry to get home. It only cares if you told it the truth." Ellis Webb spent 31 years hanging iron on high-rises downtown and never once saw his own name on a drawing. He came home every night smelling of cold steel and diesel. And every night he sat his 2 boys down at the kitchen table and made them check his math on scraps of graph paper, just so they'd understand that numbers were a promise you made to people who would never know your name. Marcus was the one who kept every one of those scraps in a shoebox under his bed. He read every engineering book in the branch library twice before he finished middle school, filled graph paper with trusses before he understood what a truss was, and left for college on a scholarship his guidance counselor had to fight the district for. 4 years later he came home with a civil engineering degree, and 8 years after that, a master's in structural engineering and a stamp of his own, M. Webb, P.E. He was one of the youngest engineers in the state to carry that license, and for a long time, one of the very few in any boardroom who looked like him at all. Dante, 3 years younger, went the other way. He became an ironworker the way some men become preachers, with reverence, not resignation. He chased jobs on his brother's projects specifically, not for favoritism, but because he trusted Marcus's math the way other men trusted gravity. If Marcus stamped it, Dante liked to tell the younger guys on the crew, grinning, "I'll walk the beam blindfolded." He said it more than once. Everybody assumed he was joking. He wasn't, not really. 7 years ago, on a mixed-use tower 3 states over, a subcontractor quietly swapped the specified rebar for a thinner, cheaper grade to shave $400,000 off their bid, and falsified the inspection tickets to bury the substitution under a stack of paperwork nobody had reason to double-check. During a scheduled pour on the 9th floor, a section gave way. 3 ironworkers died that afternoon. Dante was one of them. The investigation cleared Marcus completely. His drawings were correct. His calculations were sound. The specifications he'd stamped would have held had anyone actually built to them. It didn't feel like an acquittal. It felt like being told the gun wasn't his fault, only the bullet, and the bullet had his brother's name on it. Marcus sold his stake in the firm 18 months later. He told former colleagues he wanted to slow down, spend more time in the garden, maybe teach. What he actually wanted was to never again hand his trust to a stack of paperwork and call it safety. So he did something almost no one at his level ever does. He went back down to the ground floor, not as a consultant flown in for spot inspections, not as an expert witness, as a laborer, on the crew, badge reading only Webb, no title, no story attached. He carried Dante's old brass pocket level in his breast pocket every single day, checked it against every beam with his own 2 hands, and quietly took under his wing whichever young apprentice reminded him, in some small, unbearable way, of his brother. He never lied about who he'd been. He simply never volunteered it. Nobody in a hard hat has ever once asked another man in a hard hat for his resume. Meridian Point Tower was supposed to be the crown of Preston Cole III's career. 40 stories, glass and steel rising over the river, city tax incentives riding on a Founders Week ribbon cutting, a councilwoman's re-election campaign quietly stitched to the opening date, and a bonus structure written by Whitfield Group's ownership that rewarded speed above almost everything else. Preston had learned early that the fastest way up in this business was to look decisive on camera and make sure delays always landed on someone else's paperwork. Marcus had been on the crew for 4 months by then, the quietest man on any floor, the only one who remeasured what everyone else eyeballed and called close enough. On the 22nd floor pour, he noticed the rebar tags didn't match the delivery ticket, lighter gauge, wider spacing than the spec sheet called for. He filed a written note about it, dated and signed, the way he'd filed every concern for 4 months running. Small things, careful things. Nothing dramatic, nothing that should have needed to be dramatic. Preston read the first one out loud in front of 3 other men and laughed. Grandpa building code strikes again. The name stuck to Marcus's back like drywall dust after that, repeated at toolbox talks, muttered when Marcus walked past with his clipboard. Preston started leaving him off the safety briefings entirely, told the foreman not to bother looping him in on schedule changes. Once, in front of 2 investors touring the site in clean boots and hard hats that had never seen real dust, Preston told Marcus to go and fetch coffee. Not because anyone wanted coffee, but because he wanted the investors to see plainly where a man like that belonged in his hierarchy. Marcus fetched the coffee. He filed another note that afternoon. What Preston didn't know, what he'd never once bothered to ask, was that the rebar supplier feeding the 22nd floor Delgado supply had been brought on off-book at a steep discount, with inspection tickets Preston himself had initialed without reading closely, because reading closely might have meant admitting to himself what he'd chosen not to see. The bonus clock was running. Founders Week had a date on it already, printed on invitations. There was a Tuesday in March that Marcus never talked about afterward, though Ruth heard it secondhand from a plasterer who'd been standing close enough. Preston had walked the site with 2 out-of-town investors, narrating the tower's progress like a man reading his own press release out loud, and when he passed Marcus checking a column form with his level, he stopped just long enough to say, loud, for the investors' benefit, "This is Webb." Webb's very thorough. Webb's also the reason we're 11 days behind schedule. He didn't ask Marcus's first name. He never had, not once in 4 months. Marcus set the level down, waited for the group to move on toward the elevator core, and picked the level back up exactly where he'd left off. He didn't file a note about that one. Some things weren't worth the ink. Marcus didn't raise an alarm. He built a record instead. He photographed every mismatched rebar tag before it disappeared under the next day's pour, time-stamped on his own phone, backed up each night to a drive he kept at his sister's house. He kept carbon copies of every incident report in a waterproof folder he never let out of his truck, each one dated and countersigned by whichever inspector happened to be on site that week. He reached out quietly to Ruth Alvarez, the same county inspector who, 7 years earlier, had sat across from him during the hearings after the collapse that took his brother, and who had never once doubted a single line of his math. Ruth remembered him. More than that, Ruth trusted him, and trust like that doesn't need to be explained twice. Through a public records request that raised no eyebrows because nobody at Meridian Point knew to look for it. Marcus also retrieved a certified copy of the tower's original stamped structural drawings, drawn years earlier back, when he'd still consulted part-time for the engineering partner Whitfield Group, used before he stepped fully away from firm life to grieve his brother in peace. The engineer of record block on that title sheet had never been formally updated when he left. It still read, in small stamped letters nobody on this crew had ever thought to check. M. Webb, P.E. in the evenings after the site cleared out. Marcus taught 19-year-old Jalen Marsh, the newest apprentice ironworker, a kid with Dante's same restless hands and Dante's same habit of humming while he worked. How to read a level properly, how to trust the bubble over whatever mood the boss happened to be in that day. The numbers don't care who's watching, Marcus told him one evening, the words arriving almost unbidden, straight from his father's mouth through 30 years of distance. That's the whole job, son, believing them even when nobody else will. Both of them, without quite saying it out loud, were waiting for the same date on the calendar. The ceremonial 22nd floor topping out, live-streamed for Founders Week, cameras and council members and Richard Whitfield himself standing by with a ribbon nobody had cut yet. The morning of the ceremony. Preston staged his little performance for the cameras exactly the way he'd staged everything else that quarter. The legal pad snatched out of Marcus's hands, the broom joke, the laugh that rippled through the crowd of press and investors like static through a bad speaker. He wanted footage of himself looking decisive. He got it, and it would follow him for the rest of his life, though not in the way he expected. 40 minutes later, as the ceremonial beam was lifted into place, and the strain gauges Ruth had quietly insisted on installing weeks earlier. After one private conversation with Marcus, she never mentioned to anyone else, began logging numbers nobody on the podium was prepared for. The deflection reading on the 22nd floor crossed a threshold that made Ruth Alvarez's face go very still in a way no camera could misread. "Hold the load," she said. She didn't say it loudly. She never needed to. Preston, sensing the story slipping out of his hands in real time, tried to spin it live for the reporter still holding a microphone toward him. "This is exactly the kind of overcaution I've been dealing with all month," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Marcus. "Some people on this crew just don't want to see this project succeed." Marcus walked without hurrying to the folding table set up for ceremonial photographs and set his waterproof folder down beside the framed architectural rendering. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. Ruth opened the folder, then the certified drawing set underneath it, and read the title block out loud without quite meaning to say it to the whole crowd. "Engineer of record, M. Webb, P.E. license number." She stopped mid-sentence. She looked up from the page to the man standing in front of her in a dust-covered vest, badge reading only Webb. Richard Whitfield, standing near the ribbon in a suit that had never seen a construction site before 10 that morning, went very quiet. He remembered that name from a design contract 7 years old, from a chief engineer who'd walked away from the business after a tragedy nobody at the company liked to bring up at dinner. He looked at the badge. He looked at the photographs Ruth was now laying out beside the drawings, mismatched rebar tags, each one dated, each one filed weeks before this morning, each one countersigned by an inspector he now recognized standing 3 feet away. Preston's face didn't just pale. It emptied, live, in front of every camera he himself had invited to witness his triumph. Marcus finally spoke, quiet enough that the boom mic had to strain to catch it, the same 6 words his father had said to him on a backyard scaffold a lifetime ago. "Steel doesn't lie, Mr. Cole." A pause, long enough for the silence to do its own work. It just waits for somebody willing to listen. The topping out ceremony was halted on the spot. The 22nd floor was evacuated within the hour, workers filing down in silence past a podium still decorated with balloons nobody had the heart to take down yet. A drilled core sample confirmed by that evening exactly what Marcus had already known for weeks. That Delgado Supplies rebar ran thinner than speck across 3 separate pours, and that Preston's own initials sat beside inspection tickets that had never matched what actually arrived on site. The investigation moved fast once it finally started. Delgado Supplies' substitution scheme unraveled within a week, along with a trail of forged tickets bearing Preston's initials, and a paper trail showing exactly how much of the savings had quietly become his own year-end bonus. Preston Cole III was terminated from Whitfield Group within days and referred to the district attorney's office for potential fraud and endangerment charges tied to the falsified safety inspections. He did not appear on camera again. Richard Whitfield held a second press conference, smaller this time, no ribbon, no bonus structure riding on the calendar, and stood in front of the same crowd to publicly credit the site engineer who never once stopped checking his own numbers, even when nobody was paying him to. He did not use the word broom. Whitfield offered Marcus the formal title of engineer of record for the entire tower, a backdated pay adjustment, and a corner office on the top floor he had absolutely no interest in occupying. Marcus turned down the office. He asked for one thing in its place: that Whitfield Group fund a fully paid apprenticeship program for young ironworkers, named for his brother. The Dante Webb apprenticeship took in its first class that fall, 6 young men and women learning to read a level the way Marcus had once learned it on Joy Road. Jalen Marsh was in the first cohort, first name on the roster. Ruth Alvarez kept a photograph from that morning, not of Preston's face draining of color, though plenty of outlets ran that one, but of Marcus' folder still open on the table, looking not triumphant, just tired. The way a man looks after carrying something heavy for exactly as long as he had to, and not one day longer. On the crew, the story spread the way these things always do, in fragments and then all at once. The plasterer who'd overheard the March comment retold it a dozen times by the end of the week, each time with a little more reverence. The foreman who'd once been told not to loop Marcus in on schedule changes started nodding to him in the mornings, actually stopping to talk. Jalen, for his part, said nothing at all for 2 full days, and then showed up before sunrise with his own level in his coat pocket, bought with his own money, and asked Marcus quietly to check his form work before anyone else got there. Marcus checked it. It was close, not perfect but close, and he told him so. Meridian Point Tower opened 8 months later quietly, without a single reporter in attendance. Near the building's cornerstone, a small bronze plaque reads simply, "In memory of Dante Webb, the Steel remembers." Some mornings before a shift, Marcus and Jalen still share coffee from a dented thermos on the curb at dawn, hard hats resting on the concrete beside them, the finished tower catching the first gray light 40 stories above their heads. Marcus still checks every beam with his own 2 hands before he trusts it, his brother's brass level still riding in his breast pocket exactly where it's ridden for 7 years now. Some habits aren't meant to retire, even after the truth finally gets heard. A man who refuses to raise his voice isn't weak. He simply decided that the truth doesn't need volume to be heard, only someone patient enough to wait for the room to catch up to what he already knows. Have you ever watched someone underestimated precisely because he wouldn't perform his frustration for an audience? You just watched why that kind of quiet is the most dangerous strength there is. If this one got you, comment where you're watching from, drop a like, and subscribe for the next one, because somewhere out there right now, another quiet man is holding a level nobody's paying attention to yet.